This man's favorite song is Love Me Again by John Newman. Okay? Listen to it to get some insights into a researcher and a jolly nice chap. He is the global head of product for Nielsen, a company that's been tracking the world of media and retail for many, many years, and is now a business that is also trying to respond to the many changes that we've been hearing about over the course of the day so far. So, ladies and gentlemen, please could you give a huge welcome to Mr. Steve Hasker.
Thanks very much, Charlie, and thanks very much, everyone, for the opportunity to speak with you today. So, the world, according to Nielsen, is a world of consumer behaviour. We measure what consumers watch and what consumers buy in 104 countries across the world. We have, we believe, the deepest insights and the deepest foresight into what consumers are doing today and what consumers are likely to do tomorrow in terms of the way they interact with different brands, the way they interact with different devices, and the way they interact with different media channels. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes this morning talking about 4 trends that we think will accelerate as they pertain to the consumer and ultimately to each of your businesses. The first of those forces is the new normal, and I don't have uplifting news for you. We do a lot of primary economic research, and we believe that the recession, for most of us in most parts of the world, will be business as usual. And I'll talk a little bit about why we think that and what we think it means. It's not all depressing, but it is a reality. The second is the changing consumer. And this is really the changing demographics of consumers in individual markets, in individual countries, and they're constituting new sources of growth. And if you don't understand the demographics in your target markets, you're not going to grow to the extent you're a consumer-facing company or a company serving consumer-facing companies. You have to understand the underlying demographics. It's a very, very important principle of investment, if nothing else. Thirdly, fragmentation. We all think about fragmentation as something that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years. When I grew up in Australia, we had 3 television channels, 3 commercial broadcasters, and we had 1 publicly sponsored. Now there are 300, and soon there are 3,000. By the time you add in all the websites and all the alternatives in digital video, all the time-shifting opportunities that we all have as media consumers, it gets to 3 million or 3 billion. It's infinite in terms of the fragmentation of consumer time and attention across media channels and devices, operating systems and occasions. And then last but not least, I'm going to make a comment about big data. In a lot of ways, Nielsen was the original big data company. We were founded 90 years ago this year, and we were the first commercial enterprise to buy an IBM mainframe. So we've been coping with massive amounts of data for 90 years and distilling it into insights. And while this is the era of big data, it's not yet the era of big insights. And I want to talk a little bit about what big data means for all of us, over and above the hyperbole. Okay, so let's talk about the new normal, the recession, for a minute. So here I'm looking at the emerging and developed markets GDP growth. The red line at the top is the emerging markets from 1986 projected through to 2016, and the blue line at the bottom is the developed markets. So emerging is countries like the BRIC countries, it's Turkey, Colombia, Mexico, and so forth. And the developed is Western Europe, it's the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And it's pretty obvious there's a divergence here, and this will continue. So if you look at what's driving the red line to a higher rate of growth, it is the emergence of middle class in countries like India and China, in Colombia, in Peru, and Turkey, and so forth. And it is higher birth rates and younger populations and more vibrant populations in terms of the age, the average age of the consumer, and the number of people coming up through education or into the workforce. And if you look at the blue line, so what's happening here? Well, in the US, make no mistake, that bounce back from 2009 and the subsequent anemic growth is a function of quantitative easing. $80 billion in Treasury bond purchases per month, tapered now to 55. And as we've all seen from Janet Yellen in the last couple of weeks, she's talking about further tapering, but she's also talking it up one day and talking it down another. We're going to see quantitative easing stay in the US in operation for a period of time, and the process by which we will wean our way off that will not be a smooth glide path to growth, in our view. $80 billion a month is unprecedented, and actually taking the world's largest economy off that kind of life support will not be a smooth process. It will be bumpy, and it is unprecedented. Nobody really knows how it's going to happen, right? But the Fed has shifted its mandate into managing unemployment. And so it won't happen until the unemployment rate, until we go from 200,000 jobs added a month to 300,000 or 400,000 added a month. But when it does happen, it's going to be bumpy. And then if we come to Europe, one of the things that we're monitoring very closely is consumer prices in Europe. And what we're seeing, very worryingly, is deflation in a couple of the large Western European markets, like Spain and like Italy. And deflation, of course, causes a whole stream of issues and will put tremendous pressure on the ECB to follow down the path of quantitative easing. So while I'm not trying to depress you, what I am trying to say is that as you think about your planning cycles and your businesses, think about difficult conditions in the developed world. Think about much higher growth rates in the developing world and starting to shift investment resources to the developing world as fast and as sensibly as you can. The other thing to note is that where there is wealth, it is not evenly distributed. I know that's a very obvious statement, but this set of statistics here is truly startling, I believe. This says, so we did a study of US housing wealth, and if you think about your own personal balance sheet or that of the community, housing wealth is a tremendous portion, and the single most important asset to a consumer. And we studied this between 2000 and 2012. And what we found was that 54% of housing wealth in the US is concentrated amongst 10% of the population. 54% of housing wealth concentrated on the wealthiest 10%. And this is accelerating. So this was stark in 2000, which is the heavier purple block, and the portion of growth from 2000 to 2012 that has accumulated to the top 10% is extraordinary. So it was stark in 2000 and it's worrying in 2012. Combine this with the growth of megacities. So it doesn't matter which country you look at, people are coming off the land, coming out of the smaller regional centres and going into megacities. And what's happening in those megacities is you have, particularly in the US, the creation of enclaves. The Upper East Side in Manhattan, Deep South Manhattan. You have Boca Raton in Florida, parts of Los Angeles. These enclaves of the super wealthy. And then you have a very, very long tail of disenfranchised. So what you're seeing, led by the US, but it's not all that different in some of the major Western European markets, is a tremendous dispersion and an accelerating dispersion in terms of the concentration of wealth at one end and the level of disenfranchisement at the other. Okay, so let's talk about the changing consumer. We have charts like this for all 104 countries that we measure. This is one for the US, so I just want to make a quick point here. The grey circles represent the portion of the population that is white and non-Hispanic. And in 2010, that is a pretty significant majority. And the point is a very simple one. By 2050, white non-Hispanic will be a minority. Now, this is where the growth in the US is coming from. And talking to one of the chief marketing officers of one of the world's largest carbonated beverage companies, and I asked her, what are you focused on? How are you thinking about things? And she said, well, I'm not interested in people like you, Steve, that's for sure. I'm interested in the Hispanic communities here in the US, and I need to understand them better than my competitors. I need to have a privileged understanding of that hard-to-reach Hispanic consumer. And I need to figure out how to market to them and what kind of media, what kind of messages is going to resonate. And I need partners, whether that be Nielsen, whether that be my agencies, or whether that be the media companies that I help sponsor, who truly understand Hispanic consumers. And if you don't truly understand the Hispanic consumers, you're not very helpful to me. So it's a very stark message. Now, to the extent that immigration is slower and lower in Europe, this picture is not as acute and won't be as acute. But there's a bad message in that insofar as the immigration is where a lot of the growth is coming from. It is the minorities today becoming the majorities tomorrow from which the growth comes, because these people aspire to a higher standard of living, a higher standard of education, spend more as they go, and drive the economies forward. And this is the reason why there's some optimism in the US. This is the biggest reason there's optimism in the US. It is, we have high growth rates and high birth rates amongst some of these minority communities. Okay, so let's talk about fragmentation. Here we have some data from the US, UK, France, Australia, and India, and I just want to make a couple of points. The first is that, in the red, the PC is dead. So in our lifetime, I would put it to you that we all are likely to have seen the birth of the PC and the death of the PC. And if you look at the sales of PCs amongst consumer electronics retailers or the manufacturers, it is a very stark picture, and it's not an optimistic one. And you have a number of component suppliers who are dependent on the PC, and you're starting to see Wall Street and the City of London and so forth punish them. So that's the first point. The second point is we're almost at 100% mobile phone penetration, whether it be smartphones or feature phones, in just about every place in the world. Almost every African country, India, China, Latin America, the mobile phone is prescient. And tablets, which is the orange bars here, are starting to grow up. Right? So short the PC and go long anything mobile. From a consumer standpoint, while we've never distinguished between a 50-inch TV screen and a 22-inch TV screen, the way we think about the world at Nielsen now is, rather than different device sizes, it's about video, audio, and text, for a couple of simple reasons. As a consumer, I'm consuming video on a screen, on the best available screen, whether that's the 50-inch screen in my living room or whether that's a tablet on the bus or a smartphone somewhere else. I'm consuming video, or I'm listening to audio, or I'm consuming information in the form of text. And we think, as marketers, you need to think about video, audio, and text, and you need to design campaigns that are agnostic as to device and operating system, but they're either a video campaign, an audio campaign, or they have a surplus of information in the form of text. And that's the mindset you need to bring. It's not about, is this digital or is this analog, is this TV or is this online? It's about video, audio, text. And we think this picture starts to inform that. So another picture on fragmentation, if you look at the average American consumer, and it's a very similar picture in the UK, Australia, and most developed markets, the average American consumer has a second job, has a second full-time job, and that second full-time job is consuming media, 60 hours a week. The majority of that, 37 hours, is still on the TV set. So it literally is still sitting at home watching the TV set, whether that be broadcast or cable, whether that be the signal coming through those traditional means, or whether it be over-the-top video. And the one that's really that's still very small is 0.1 hours on mobile video, but that is growing explosively. And as I said, it's about video. So when I show you this picture next time, it will be about video versus audio versus text. It won't be device-centric. So let's talk a bit more about fragmentation. I would argue that when all of us were growing up, the consumer purchase funnel was a pretty simple one. So we would start with a demand. We'd have an idea that we needed something to eat or something to wear or something to entertain us. And then we'd do some research pre-store. So we'd read a magazine or the newspaper, we'd watch television, we'd listen to the radio, and we had relatively discrete alternatives to learn which products were available and which ones we might buy. We then went into the store, we made a purchase, and we either liked it or we didn't. We became loyal customers or we didn't. But it was a pretty linear process. And it was a process that was relatively infrequent compared to today. So what's happened going forward? Well, it's become a mess. It's become a huge mess. The number of influences on any particular consumer purchase decision have exploded as the number of media have exploded and as the time spent consuming media has exploded. And I'd call out two particular points here, and they're in these green circles. The first one is meant to demonstrate social media. So we all think and talk a lot about social media, and we're trying to understand what is the significance of it. But I would argue that social influence, and I've done quite a lot of research on this, social influence has always been very important to determine what sort of products you're likely to buy. But it's on steroids in a digital environment. The ability to interact with your Facebook friends and understand what products they like. The ability to look at a Twitter stream and understand what's trending. what products and services are exploding in terms of growth, has put that water cooler effect on steroids as it pertains to consumer products and entertainment services. And if you think about the teenagers of today, and many of you will have kids, many of you have nieces and nephews who are teenagers, perhaps brothers and sisters, there's a couple of real differences to their behaviour compared to my behaviour, and I would argue your behaviour too. So when I grew up in Australia playing Australian rules football, nobody had a Sony Handycam to record the game. Perhaps one kid's parents did for one game. It's totally different now. I would argue that teenagers today are more interested in watching themselves kick a goal than they are watching David Beckham kick a goal. And that presents a fundamental issue for the owners of sports rights, for the broadcasters of sports. And I'm not saying that football is less popular, I'm just saying there's a real alternative for teenagers, and they're very interested in seeing their own stuff. And that's what accounts for a lot of the growth of some of the social networks and for user-generated content. So that's one difference. And the second difference is, while we have always been influenced by what our friends liked and what our friends thought we should buy, this is a group of people who are more influenced by what their friends buy and what their friends tell them to buy than they are the professionally endorsed messages. And I think those are two fundamental changes in terms of consumer behaviour that we all need to take advantage of in a lot of ways. And if you think about the second circle here, this is the use of the mobile phone in the store. This is the use of the mobile phone in the store. We believe about 10 to 15% of all consumer packaged goods purchases are influenced by the use of a mobile device, more often than not a smartphone, but sometimes a tablet, in the store to do comparison shopping, in the store to actually take advantage of promotions and discounts and bulk buying. And what this does is it disenfranchises or disintermediates the retailer. So you think about in the old days, you walk into a retail store, you're owned by the retailer, the price, the promotion, the product, the placement, everything that goes on there. Didn't mean you had to buy anything, but you didn't have an active means of real-time comparison. That has gone. So this provides opportunities for the manufacturers of products. It provides very significant opportunities for media companies to actually become present all the way to the end of that purchase funnel. And it means that everyone's in the media business. Everyone's in the media business. It's not just the domain of the television networks or the newspapers or the magazine companies. Everybody's in the media business. Everyone can communicate direct to a consumer on their behalf or on others' behalf. So the fragmentation has meant that the consumer purchase funnel is very, very different. And whether you're a retailer, a manufacturer, an agency, or a research company, you have to understand this and you have to understand how it's moving and where it'll go. So let's talk for a minute about big data. This is the Opti Project's picture, visualization of the internet a couple of years ago. And if you looked at it today, it's even more explosive. All of the different connections occurring at any period of time across the globe. Big data. So in a sense, you either have it or you don't, right? And there are a number of competitors, some of whom are represented in this room, who have it. So YouTube users upload 12 years of video in a single day. Facebook users share 2.5 billion pieces of content in a single day. Instagram users upload 40 million photos, and Twitter users send 400 million tweets in a single day. And you imagine the amount of data that is kept and stored by those companies. So what does this mean for the marketer and for the agencies? It means that you're no longer a communicator, you have to be a consumer scientist. I spent some time with the CEO of Viacom recently, and he said, you know, Steve, you wouldn't believe it. We've just hired 5 maths PhDs because we're starting to accumulate more and more user data around the consumers of MTV, around the consumers of Comedy Central and CMT and so forth, and we've got to understand what to do with it. So I would argue there's an imperative for everybody in the media, entertainment, and in fact marketing industries to gain these talents, to employ these talents and to figure out how to use them. So how do you win in this world? How do you win in a world where the economy is not going to help you? You can't get out of bed and rely on growth to just fly in through the window. Where the consumer is changing. The consumer's demographic, their taste, the way they behave, the way they interact is changing. And the consumer is facing an ever-exploding number of alternatives. Well, we would argue that one thing you can do, even if you don't have big data to take advantage of, is a right set of partnerships. And what you want to do is develop the privileged understanding, the privileged access to the hardest to reach demographics, the hardest to reach audiences, using data partnerships. And if you think about one small example, anytime I'm in Silicon Valley and talking to the major Silicon Valley players about the local media business in the US. So this is the idea of getting into Chicago and Los Angeles, Des Moines, and actually figuring out how to market to the individual local consumers in those markets. The Silicon Valley players always start with, if only I had the local ad sales force. So if you're in the local TV business, or you're in the newspaper business, you have that ad sales force. You have the feet on the street, and you have the relationship and the understanding of not only the consumer, but you have the relationship with the small business owner, with the butcher and the florist and the hairdresser and so forth. That is incredibly valuable, and that is the basis for a partnership with a player who has a big data set. And put together, it can be a very, very powerful combination. So to give you a couple of examples from my world of what we've tried to do in terms of taking advantage of some of these trends. The measurement business that my predecessors grew up with was about helping management. It was about looking back and helping management understand what had happened, who had won and who had lost, and therefore what had needed to be done. And we argue now it's about growth. And if we can't help our clients grow, then we're not all that helpful to them. And that doesn't matter whether they're in the TV business, in the digital video business, or in the consumer packaged goods space, or the agency space. We have to be able to help them grow through better insights. So what have we done? Well, one of the things we've done is we take our Nielsen panel, which is a very, very high quality panel, but small. So it's one that we recruit in person. We knock on the door, we ask the people. We know exactly who's in the household. We know whether they buy a Toyota, how many smartphones they have, how many kids they have, and so forth. And we've combined that with Facebook. We've combined that with Facebook's registration database. So this is 1.2 billion people across the world from which we take age and gender and hometown. And we do that in a privacy-protected way. And we're able to calibrate that Facebook data using our panel. So in other words, correct. Because, believe it or not, there are some young girls on Facebook who pretend they're older. And I will shock you to know there are some old men on Facebook who pretend they're younger. And we're able to correct for that. But when you take this data and you combine it with Facebook, and then you combine it with a source like Experian that has ethnic information, that has income information, presence of kids, and education, you can produce ratings for the entire population, not just a panel of people, not just a small sample, and they constitute currency quality ratings. So this is our online campaign ratings product that we now have in 10 different markets and 80% of the world's digital spend. And it really is the future of the media business because it takes the very, very small but very high quality panels and it combines them with big data sets so that no matter how fragmented a campaign, we can measure it on a daily basis and soon on a real-time basis very, very accurately. The second example for us is in the area of social media. Like many of you, we've studied social media now for 4 or 5 years or more. And of all the things that have happened in social media, there's one that we noticed in 2012 that we thought was particularly interesting. And that was an explosion in the growth of the number of people tweeting about TV programs. So many of us have looked at interactive TV over the years and said, okay, what is this going to be about? Is this going to be about sitting on the sofa, pressing a button to buy Jennifer Aniston's sweater, or to order a pizza, or to bet on the horse race that I'm watching? Or is it going to be about preserving the TV experience as a lean-back experience from the sofa and interacting on a mobile device in my hand? Well, it turns out it's been the latter so far. And my bet is it will continue to be the latter. What we noticed was explosive growth in the number of people tweeting about the programs, the characters in the programs, the storylines, the plots, and also the commercials in the programs. And so with that, we struck an exclusive partnership with Twitter for the US and for a number of other markets. We're about to roll this out in Italy and Australia, whereby we measure not only the number of people tweeting about a TV program, we also measure the reach of those tweets. So in other words, the number of people who read a tweet in addition to the number of people who tweeted. And this is a little bit like Wikipedia, right? If I ask for a show of hands here, everyone here has read Wikipedia, but not everyone here has actually made an entry on Wikipedia or made a correction on Wikipedia. This is the same thing. Many of us have not tweeted about a TV program, but many of us have seen a tweet about a TV program, and in fact it's about 50x. So what does this enable a marketer to do? Well, for the first time, they can understand on a daily basis or in real time what is a high social engagement program versus a low social engagement program. And a programmer from episode to episode can look at why is it that this week's episode or that character garnered more social interest? And who was interested? Was it in fact the target audience or was it someone else? And what was it that drove that engagement? So we don't know where this one's going to go from a research perspective and the extent to which it will influence the media buy and the pricing of that buy. But it's very, very early days, and it's very, very interesting days for us and for our clients in the social TV space. So just to wrap up, 4 forces. The new normal, again, not meaning to depress anyone here, but you have to think about an economy that will not naturally help you along. The changing consumer in the form of different demographics, fragmentation accelerating, and lastly, thinking about ways in which to turn big data, which in and of itself is a description of a problem, not a solution, into big insights. And the best way to do that, we believe, is partnering with people and taking your assets into that partnership with others who either have the data or have other forms of access. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and ask Charlie to come back up for any questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm a bit worried about this recession is the new normal. I mean, doesn't it conflict a bit with Steve King's comment yesterday that overall ad expenditure is looking positive?
Well, I do think that, I mean, there's something about, in this fragmented world, it's getting harder and harder to reach consumers. The imperative to reach those consumers is going up, not down. So it's likely, and I know Sir Martin Sorrell argues this, and I agree, it's likely that the portion of GDP that is devoted to ad spend goes up, firstly. Secondly, interactive platforms enable marketers to take money out of direct response and put it into measured media. And I think we're just starting to see the advent of that. And if you think about $100 spent in total media, measured media is about 1/3 of it. The rest is the below the line stuff. And so even if you take 5 or 10% of that, you're talking about major growth for media companies. Yeah. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but there's a real opportunity there.
We started this event with a doctor from the Large Hadron Collider. I don't know whether you saw that, talking about particle physics and finding the Higgs boson. Obviously, the big issue in science is whether you can reconcile the quantum world with the macro world and have a unified theory. I suppose you're the best person to ask this sort of rather lofty question, but Nielsen's been tracking commerce for decades and retail receipts. You've now got this deal with Twitter. You're involved with many meter paneling systems. How close are we to having some sort of unified theory of marketing where we're able to truly understand the inputs in both the offline and online world, not just attribution, to the final outputs? Will that ever happen?
Well, one of the things that we're doing more and more of is taking our media exposure information, particularly using the census methodology I talked about with Facebook and Experian, and combining that in a PII-protected way with credit card data. So in other words, did you see a commercial? And if you did you go and buy more of the product? And that, we're just starting that. But that, in a sense, gets to the Holy Grail, because it says, all right, you know, I spent £10 million on a particular commercial, or $10 million, and it did or didn't work in a period of time. It works well for fast-moving consumer goods, where, you know, you go to the grocery store at least every couple of days, if not once a week. It doesn't work so well for automotive, right, for the sort of big, periodic at best purchases. And so I think you're going to see real progress in some industries, some verticals, and glacial progress, to be candid, in others.
Do you see Nielsen investing in attribution businesses?
Yes.
Any particular ones that interest you most?
It's a pretty crowded space at the moment, and there's a lot of talent pouring into that space. So, including, you know, some of our best scientists. So, you know, sort of watch this space, I suppose.
And what about sort of social listening and those other sorts of companies as well?
So we had a social listening business. We acquired it many, many years ago. And we actually morphed it into this Nielsen Twitter TV ratings business because we're highly differentiated in that space, and we like those businesses where we're the only source of the data. We're not so keen on the sort of generic listing space where there are lots and lots and lots of providers, very small barriers to entry. You know, that's a tough space. I mean, if you're a very low-cost provider and you're enabling people to swipe a credit card and get some insights about a brand, it's okay. But certainly from the research business, you want to have something that others don't have, and that's why we morphed.
Martin Sorrell frequently claims that, you know, let's not just talk about my competitors being Omnicom and Publicis and so on, but frequently cites Nielsen as a competitor. By implication, is there a possibility that Nielsen could start coming up with the creative services that you can graft onto your data? Could Nielsen ever become an advertising agency?
No, we won't. I just don't see it because companies like WPP have a tremendous array of assets. One thing I would argue, and admittedly I'm biased in this argument, that they don't have is independence. And the minute we get into sort of advising on or creating creative, I would argue we lose some of that independence. What we're able to do today is say, this is how many people saw a particular ad, this is how it resonated, and this is the behaviour it drove. But the minute you get into the sort of the creation of that ad in the beginning, I think there's a perception that you're trying to tilt the scales one way or another. And we will always stay away from that.
Okay. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Steve.
Charlie.
Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Hasker from Nielsen. Very good. Very interesting.